Billionaire's daughter had never spoken. Until the new maid discovered the truth, everyone believed the billionaire's daughter would never speak again. For 6 long years she hadn't said a single word to anyone, not her teachers, not her doctors, not even her own father. They said it was trauma. They said her voice was gone forever, and her father accepted it. He filled his house with silence and his heart with guilt. But everything changed the day a new maid arrived. She wasn't a doctor or a specialist, just someone who paid attention and cared enough to listen. What she discovered inside that mansion would unravel years of lies, heal a broken family, and awaken a voice that had been stolen since birth. This is the story of how one woman turned silence into hope. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's begin. Richard Wakefield was a man everyone admired, a billionaire in the world of agriculture, known for his discipline, precision, and success. But behind all that power, he lived a life that no amount of money could fix. His mansion stood miles away from the city, beautiful, enormous, and utterly quiet. Every corner of it whispered the same thing: loneliness. 5 years earlier, tragedy had struck. Richard's wife died in a helicopter crash, just days after their daughter Luna was born. He never recovered from that loss. When Luna turned 2, doctors told him she suffered from selective mutism. They said her mind could understand, but her voice refused to respond. Richard blamed himself. He believed the trauma of losing her mother had somehow reached her before she could even speak. Every day became a routine of silence. He tried to fill her world with everything she could ever need: toys, tutors, doctors from around the world, but none of it made a difference. Luna never spoke. She didn't laugh. She didn't call out for anyone. She just sat near the large window, watching the world she never described. And Richard, day after day, sat nearby, reading stories aloud to a child who never answered him. Sometimes, late at night, he would whisper, "Do you know my voice, Luna?" But the only reply he ever heard was the echo of his own question. Julia Bennett was 27 years old, and she had just survived the hardest year of her life. Only a few months earlier, she had lost her newborn daughter. The doctors couldn't explain why. Since that day, her apartment had felt smaller, her world quieter, and her heart completely empty. One morning, while sitting in a hospital waiting room, she saw a small advertisement in a newspaper. It said, "Housekeeper needed. Private residence, confidential." Something inside her whispered that she should call. She didn't expect to get the job. But when Richard Wakefield opened the door himself, he saw something in her eyes, a kind of quiet pain that mirrored his own. He asked about her experience. She spoke simply, honestly. She told him she had lost a child and was looking for a way to start over. He said nothing for a long moment, then finally nodded. The job was hers. On her first day, Julia noticed the house felt frozen in time. Everything was perfectly clean, but nothing felt alive. The air was heavy with silence. Then she saw Luna for the first time. The little girl sat by the window, her small hands holding a worn-out stuffed bear. Her eyes were open but distant, as if she lived somewhere far away. Julia stood quietly, watching the girl for a few seconds. Luna didn't turn her head, didn't react to the new presence in the room. Julia didn't speak either. She just smiled gently and went back to her work. But in that short moment, she felt something she couldn't explain. This wasn't the silence of illness or stubbornness. It was the silence of a child who had never been heard, and from that day on, Julia decided she would listen, even if no one else ever had. Days passed quietly in the Wakefield mansion. Julia followed her routine, cleaning rooms, arranging flowers, preparing meals. But every day her eyes found Luna. The girl never spoke, but Julia began to notice little things. When she entered a room, Luna's head would turn slightly. When Julia dropped something by accident, Luna would flinch just a little. Those tiny reactions told her something important. Luna was aware. She heard, she felt, she just couldn't respond. Julia stopped trying to talk to her directly. Instead, she worked in silence, humming softly as she cleaned. Old songs, lullabies she used to sing to her baby. At first, Luna didn't move. But one afternoon, Julia heard a sound, a faint hum coming from the corner near the window. It was off-key, uncertain, but it was there. Julia froze. Her heart raced. She turned slowly and saw Luna's lips moving. Barely, but unmistakably, she didn't interrupt. She just kept humming, matching the little girl's rhythm. For the first time they were connected, not by words but by sound. From then on, Julia began using soft music while she worked. Sometimes piano, sometimes just her voice. Luna started sitting closer, listening quietly, her expression gentler, calmer. One morning, Julia placed a set of colored pencils on the table and left a blank sheet of paper beside them. She didn't say a word. An hour later, when she returned, she found a small drawing. A circle, uneven and simple, but drawn by Luna's hand. That was the first real sign. Luna wasn't lost inside herself. She was waiting for someone to reach her differently, not with questions or demands, but with patience and presence, and Julia, without even trying, had begun to find the way in. Weeks went by, and the bond between Julia and Luna grew stronger. Julia still hadn't heard a single word from the girl, but there was a new energy in the house. Luna began following the sound of Julia's footsteps, turning her head when Julia entered a room. Sometimes she even smiled, just a faint one, but enough to melt the silence. Richard noticed the change too. He didn't say much, but for the first time in years he seemed curious. One morning, while organizing the bathroom cabinet, Julia noticed something odd. Several small bottles, each labeled with Luna's name. She picked one up and read the fine print. They were prescription drops, not for the eyes or ears, but for speech-related anxiety. Julia frowned. She had seen similar medication before, when her own baby was treated for mild respiratory issues. But the dosage here was unusually strong, too strong for a child. Later that evening, she discreetly looked up the name of the medicine on her phone. Her heart sank. The drug was meant to calm the nerves, but one of its side effects was the temporary paralysis of vocal cords, especially in children. Julia sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. Had Luna been kept silent not by trauma, but by the very treatment meant to help her? The next morning, when the house was still quiet, Julia made a choice. She skipped Luna's usual dose. Just once, just to see. That afternoon, as Julia was folding laundry near Luna's playroom, she heard something she hadn't heard in 6 years. A sound. A voice, soft, shaky, barely more than a breath. Julia turned quickly. Luna was sitting on the rug, her lips parted, trying to form a word. Nothing came out but a tiny gasp, like the echo of something long forgotten. Julia knelt beside her and whispered, "It's all right, sweetheart. You can try." Luna looked at her, her eyes uncertain, and took another breath. A sound again, slightly clearer this time. It wasn't a full word. But it was a beginning. A fragile sound that carried more hope than anything Julia had heard in that house before. The next few days were filled with quiet anticipation. Julia didn't mention what she had heard to anyone, not even Richard. She wanted to be certain before speaking a word. She continued skipping Luna's medication. And each day the little girl seemed more awake, more present, more alive. Then one night it happened. Julia was tucking Luna into bed, as she did every evening. The soft lamp by the bedside cast a warm light across the room. Julia hummed the same lullaby she had sung every night since she arrived, but this time Luna's lips moved. Julia stopped humming, holding her breath. A small, trembling voice filled the silence. "Mommy." It was barely audible, fragile as air, but it was real. Julia's eyes filled with tears. She didn't dare move, afraid the moment might disappear. Luna looked up again. Her tiny voice quivered. "Mommy." Light. Julia felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to call Richard right away, but before she could, he appeared at the doorway. He had heard everything. For a long moment, no one spoke. He stepped closer, kneeling beside his daughter, his hands shaking. "Luna," he whispered. "Did you just—" Luna turned her eyes toward him, smiled faintly, and whispered again, "Daddy." The words seemed to echo through the entire house. 6 years of silence shattered by one fragile sound. Richard broke down, pulling her into his arms, sobbing into her hair. Julia stood quietly, tears streaming down her face, watching the moment unfold. The truth was no longer a secret. Luna could speak. She always could. She'd just never been given the chance. That night changed everything. Richard didn't sleep at all. He sat in his study, staring at the small bottle of medicine Julia had found. For 6 years he had trusted the doctors completely. never once questioning the treatment that kept his daughter quiet. Now, he could barely breathe thinking about it. The next morning, Julia told him everything she had discovered, how she had researched the medication, how she suspected it was never meant for Luna, and how she had stopped giving it to her. Instead of anger, Richard felt shame. He had spent years surrounded by experts, yet it was the maid, the woman who truly cared, who uncovered the truth. Together they took the medicine to a local clinic, where Julia's friend, a nurse named Sophia, worked. She agreed to have it tested. A few days later, the results came back. The drug contained high doses of nerve inhibitors, chemicals that could partially numb vocal cords over time. It wasn't standard medication. It was experimental. Sophia looked at them both, horrified. "Who prescribed this?" she asked. Richard's voice trembled as he answered, "Dr. Atticus Morrow." Sophia's face went pale. She had heard of him, a neurologist already under investigation for using unapproved treatments on children. The truth was clear. Luna had never been mute. She had been silenced. Richard's grief turned to rage. He contacted his lawyers the same day. Within weeks, the doctor was exposed, his license suspended, his clinic shut down. But justice wasn't what mattered most to Richard anymore. What mattered was Luna, the little girl who had suffered in silence while he trusted the wrong people. That evening, he sat beside her as she played with her toys. Her voice was still soft and uncertain, but she was learning new words every day. And for the first time, when Richard whispered, "Good night, Luna," she smiled and whispered back, "Good night, Daddy." Months passed and the Wakefield mansion was no longer silent. Every morning, Luna's laughter echoed down the marble halls. She had begun speech therapy, and though her words came slowly, each one felt like a small miracle. Julia stayed by her side through every session, celebrating every new word, every little sound that used to be impossible. Richard never missed a single appointment. He watched his daughter rediscover her own voice, and with it a part of himself he thought was gone forever. He often wondered how different life might have been if Julia had never come into their world. But then he would look at Luna, smiling, talking, calling out Daddy or Miss Julia, and he'd stop wondering. The house that once felt like a tomb now felt like a home. There was conversation at dinner, music in the mornings, and hope in every room. The trial against Dr. Morrow came to an end. He was found guilty and sentenced for malpractice and fraud. But for the Wakefields, the real victory was hearing Luna's voice fill the courtroom, as she bravely said her own name when asked to speak. Years later, the world saw a very different Luna. At 12 years old, she stood on stage at a charity event, raising awareness for children with speech disorders. Her father and Julia sat in the front row, tears in their eyes. When it was her turn to speak, Luna smiled at the crowd and said, "For a long time, I didn't have a voice, but someone believed in me when no one else did." And that changed everything. The audience rose to their feet in applause. Julia wiped her eyes as Luna continued, "I was silent for years, but it was love that taught me how to speak." And with those words, the story that began in silence ended in hope, because sometimes the quietest souls don't need to be fixed, they just need to be heard. Some stories remind us that silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's a wound waiting for understanding. Luna found her voice because someone chose to listen, not out of duty, but out of love. And maybe that's what the world needs a little more of. People who notice the small things. People who don't walk away when everything seems hopeless. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to remember someone who once believed in you. And if you can, be that person for someone else today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that prove love can change everything.